April 15, 1996, 2:37 p.m. The National Archives, College Park, Maryland. In the sterile quiet of Research Room 203, punctuated only by the soft rustle of turning pages and the low, constant hum of the HVAC system, historian Jack Neese felt a jolt of unexpected discovery. He wasn't even looking for it. While sifting through unrelated World War II logistics files, his fingers, dusty from decades-old paper, landed on a thick, string-bound folder, stamped in faded red ink, top secret. The file number was 322.0-23. Its title, innocuous yet intriguing, Official History of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. He felt a prickle of adrenaline, the historian's instinct that he was about to uncover something deliberately buried. The world knew the end of the war in Europe as a story of overwhelming force, a brutal calculus of steel and men. By March 1945, Lieutenant General William Hood Simpson's U.S. Ninth Army stood at the precipice of the Rhine River, the final natural barrier to the heart of Germany. But staring back from the opposite bank were two of the Wehrmacht's most formidable units, the 183rd Volksgrenadier and the battle-hardened 11th Panzer Division. Allied intelligence, specifically G2 reports from the 12th Army Group under General Omar Bradley, projected catastrophic casualties, estimating a loss of nearly 15,000 men in the initial 48 hours of any direct assault crossing near Rheinberg. The air was thick with the stench of inevitable bloodshed, a grim acceptance that victory would be paid for with thousands of American lives. What no one in Simpson's army, or in the German High Command, could possibly know was that the key to unlocking this stalemate wasn't more firepower, but an elaborate, top-secret theatrical performance orchestrated by a unit that, officially, didn't exist. The genesis of this phantom unit began on the bitterly cold morning of January 20, 1944. Deep within the 15,000-acre perimeter of Section K9 at Camp Forest, Tennessee, Colonel Harry L. Reeder, a meticulous 1920 West Point graduate, officially activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Reeder, a career artilleryman whose by-the-book demeanor hid a mind for radical deception, was paired with Major Ralph McAllister Ingersoll, a Yale-educated mining engineer and former editor of the New York newspaper, Times PM. Ingersoll, with his perpetually ink-stained fingers and a knack for shaping public perception, was the perfect foil for Reeder's military precision. Together, under the authority of Army Secret File OPS 322.0, they were tasked with building a mobile, multimedia, tactical deception unit from a hand-picked collection of 100 artists, ad men, and sound engineers, sworn to a level of secrecy so absolute that even their families would never know the truth. Their mission was, on its face, impossible: to convincingly impersonate entire American divisions, sometimes numbering over 30,000 men, right on the front lines. This wasn't about wooden dummies in a distant field. This was about creating a multi-sensory illusion of a massive military force so believable it would fool German reconnaissance just miles away. The 100 men of the Ghost Army were armed not with heavy artillery, but with over 600 inflatable D5 Model M4 Sherman tanks, each weighing only 93 pounds, and powerful 500-watt RCA speakers capable of projecting the sounds of an armored division up to 15 miles away. Before I tell you how Colonel Reeder and his 100 artists managed to fool two entire German divisions with nothing more than rubber, sound, and pure audacity, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the story of how the Ghost Army conjured phantom forces that saved an estimated 30,000 American lives. By late 1944, the optimism that followed the D-Day landings on June 6 had curdled into a grim, grinding reality. In the Hurtgen Forest, a 50-square-mile nightmare of dense woods and ravines along the German-Belgian border, General Courtney Hodges' U.S. First Army was being bled white. From September 19, 1944, to February 10, 1945, American forces suffered over 33,000 casualties trying to break the Siegfried Line, a static defense commanded with brutal efficiency by General Feldmarschall Walter Model. The air was a permanent, choking mixture of damp earth, rotting pine needles, and the acrid tang of cordite from constant artillery barrages. This brutal attrition warfare presented a strategic crisis for the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his ground commander, General Omar Bradley of the 12th Army Group, stared at their operations maps in late 1944, seeing not a path to victory, but a meat grinder chewing up their best divisions. They had air supremacy and overwhelming numbers, but the German soldier, defending his homeland from behind formidable fortifications, was exacting a horrific price for every yard of territory. A new kind of weapon was needed, one that didn't rely on brute force. They needed an asymmetric advantage the enemy couldn't even comprehend, let alone counter. The casualty reports from the 4th and 28th Infantry Divisions were a constant, bloody reminder that something had to change, and fast. The primary obstacle was the West Wall, or Siegfried Line, a defensive system stretching more than 390 miles. It wasn't just a line. It was a deep, complex network of over 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and anti-tank obstacles, conceived by the brilliant military engineer Fritz Todt before the war. German units, like the 275th Infantry Division, were masters of this terrain. They used the interlocking fields of fire from their MG-42 machine guns, which could spit out 200 rounds per minute, to create kill zones that turned Allied advances into suicidal charges. For the American GI, the West Wall was a concrete monster, its presence felt in the constant gnawing tension and the sight of German dragon's teeth tank traps rising from the mud like a prehistoric skeleton. It was a fortress built to break armies and spirits, and under the command of General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, it was doing exactly that. Into this world of steel and concrete stepped Colonel Harry L. Reeder. A 1920 West Point graduate, Reeder was the epitome of a career artilleryman, ramrod straight, his uniform always impeccably pressed, a man who believed in order, discipline, and the precise calculations of firepower. He'd spent 2 decades mastering the science of destruction, yet his new command, activated on January 20, 1944, had no heavy guns. Reeder, a man who habitually polished his own brass buttons until they gleamed, was now tasked with orchestrating the greatest military sleight of hand in history, a mission that went against every conventional doctrine he had ever learned. The intellectual architect of this chaos was Major Ralph McAllister Ingersoll, a man who couldn't have been more different from his commander. A Yale-educated engineer and former editor of the New York newspaper Times PM, Ingersoll saw the war not as a series of tactical problems, but as a narrative. He believed you could shape the enemy's reality by telling them a better story. Often seen with ink stains on the cuffs of his officer's shirt and a half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips, he brought a Madison Avenue sensibility to the battlefield, scripting deceptions with the same flair he'd used to lay out a Sunday edition. It was Ingersoll who, on February 12, 1944, convinced Reeder that their 100 men weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were performers on the world's most dangerous stage. The cast for this performance was assembled from the most unlikely corners of the U.S. Army. From January to May 1944, talent scouts scoured the rosters, pulling 100 men not for their marksmanship, but for their creativity. They drafted artists from the Pratt Institute and the Rhode Island School of Design, architects who understood perspective, sound engineers from Bell Labs and NBC Radio, and advertising men who knew the art of persuasion. These recruits were brought to the isolated Section K9 of Camp Forest, Tennessee, a 15,000-acre swath of woodland, where they were sworn to an oath of secrecy so severe it was classified under Army Secret File OPS 322.0. The air in their barracks was a strange cocktail of military-issue wool, gun oil, and the distinct, civilian smells of turpentine and rubber cement. Leading the visual deception efforts of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers was a young corporal named William Bill Blass. Before the war, Blass had been a promising fashion student at the Parsons School of Design, his world one of fabric and form. Now his design skills were applied to fooling German reconnaissance. He'd spend hours directing his four-man crews, the rhythmic hiss of their portable air compressors filling the Tennessee woods, as they inflated the 93-pound D5 Model M4 Sherman tanks. Blass, who always carried a small sketchbook, would meticulously check the placement of each 19-foot-long rubber decoy, ensuring the shadows they cast were perfect, that they looked right to a Focke-Wulf FW-189 reconnaissance pilot flying at 7,000 feet. It was surreal, high-stakes art direction. For these men, the war was a bizarre paradox. They operated within miles of the front lines, close enough to hear the crump of incoming German 88mm artillery and feel the ground shake. They endured the same freezing rain and sea rations as the infantry, yet they were armed with paintbrushes and speakers. Their primary defense was their own ingenuity. This created a unique psychological strain, a feeling of being both a participant and a spectator in the deadliest conflict in human history, a tension that bound the 100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops together in a secret, silent brotherhood. The auditory dimension of their deception fell to the 3,132nd Signal Service Company Special, a unit of sound wizards led by Captain Stanley Nance. A quiet, intense acoustical engineer scouted directly from Bell Telephone Laboratories, Nance was a master of his craft. His team operated a fleet of M3 half-tracks, each one a mobile sound studio. Inside, a custom-built 300-pound turntable spun massive 16-inch acetate transcription discs. These weren't records of big bands. They were meticulously cataloged soundscapes of war, recorded with dozens of microphones at Fort Knox in early 1944. Nance could, with the flick of a switch, project the sound of an entire armored division, the specific squeal of the 761st Tank Battalion's Sherman treads, the shouted commands of their officers, through a bank of 500-watt RCA speakers, an illusion audible up to 15 miles away. Then there was the most subtle deception of all, spoof radio. This tiny 16-man team, the Signal Company Special, was the ghost in the machine. Led by Lieutenant Arthur P. Jacobson, they became experts at mimicking the unique Morse code sending style, or FIST, of radio operators from real American divisions. German signals intelligence, the Funkaufklärung relied on these FISTs to track unit movements. Jacobson's men, operating from a single WC-54 radio truck, would generate hours of perfectly credible, bogus traffic, from fake orders for 5,000 gallons of gasoline for the 6th Armored Division, to mundane chatter between company clerks, all following the strict frequency hopping schedules dictated by Security Protocol S-17B. They were creating an entire division out of thin airwaves. What's incredible is how this flew under the radar of nearly everyone. The Allies had already pulled off the masterful strategic deception of Operation Fortitude before D-Day, fooling the Germans into thinking the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. But that was a grand, strategic illusion, orchestrated hundreds of miles away by the London Controlling Section under Colonel John Bevan. The Ghost Army was something new, something radical. Tactical deception deployed directly on the front lines, a fluid, responsive performance meant to manipulate the enemy commander's decisions in real time. It was a doctrine being written on the fly, a secret held even from the corps-level staff planning the next attack. The logistical challenge was immense. Every 24 to 72 hours, the unit had to pack up their entire show. over 600 inflatable tanks, 20 M3 half-tracks, loaded with 300-pound turntables, miles of communication wire, and the massive generators needed to power it all and move to a new location, often under the cover of darkness. The low, constant hum of the generators was their biggest giveaway, a sound that carried for miles in the still night air. Captain Charles M. Spofford, the unit's logistics officer, became an expert at using terrain and ambient battle noise to mask their operations, a constant, nerve-wracking shell game played just out of sight of the enemy. By March 1945, the situation had reached its tipping point. The failure of the German offensive in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, which began on December 16, 1944, had cost the Wehrmacht its last strategic reserves. Now, the Allies were pushing for the final barrier, the Rhine River. Lieutenant General William Hood Simpson's U.S. Ninth Army was poised to launch Operation Plunder, a massive assault crossing. But facing them across the water were the formidable 183rd Volksgrenadier Division and remnants of the elite 11th Panzer Division, now under the command of General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring. These were battle-hardened troops, determined to defend the German fatherland to the last man. The numbers were horrifying. Intelligence officers in General Omar Bradley's G2 section ran the calculations, and the reports that landed on Simpson's desk on March 15, 1945, were unambiguous. A direct assault on the prepared German positions near Rheinberg would likely result in 15,000 American casualties within the first 48 hours. It was a price the Allied command was desperate not to pay. The memory of the Hurtgen Forest was still fresh, a bloody lesson in the cost of frontal assaults against a determined, dug-in enemy. They needed a miracle. And so, the order was given. On the evening of March 17, 1945, a coded message was sent from 12th Army Group Headquarters to Colonel Harry L. Reeder. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was to move immediately from its holding area in Luxembourg to a forward position near Viersen, Germany. Their mission, codenamed Operation Viersen, was their most audacious yet, to impersonate two entire divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry, and convince the German High Command that the main Allied assault was coming 10 miles south of the real target. The fate of Operation Plunder and the lives of 30,000 men now rested on the success of their illusion. The secret was born on the bitterly cold morning of January 20, 1944, at precisely 0800 hours. Deep inside the 15,000-acre perimeter of Section K9 at Camp Forest, Tennessee, Colonel Harry L. Reeder stood beside Major Ralph Ingersoll as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was officially activated under Army Secret File OPS 322.0. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the bizarre collection of 100 ad men, artists, and engineers assembled before them. This wasn't an army of riflemen, it was a hand-picked cast for the most elaborate stage production in history. The visual component fell to the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, where artists like Corporal Bill Blass, a promising student from the Parsons School of Design, traded charcoal for air compressors. Their primary medium was the D5 model inflatable M4 Sherman tank, a 93-pound marvel of vulcanized rubber and neoprene-coated canvas. A four-man crew, their movements practiced and efficient, could bring one of the 600 decoys to its full 19-foot length in under 20 minutes. The hiss of the compressors became the soundtrack of their work. Blass, alongside painter Arthur Shilstone, wasn't just inflating balloons. They were sculpting reality, meticulously studying how a 32-ton steel tank cast a shadow at 1,500 hours versus a 93-pound rubber one, a subtle but critical detail for fooling a Focke-Wulf FW-189 pilot flying 5,000 feet overhead. But sight was only half the battle. The soul of the deception was sound, a domain mastered by Captain Stanley Nance and the 3,132nd Signal Service Company. An acoustical engineer plucked from Bell Telephone Laboratories, Nance understood that the illusion required absolute sonic fidelity. His team spent 2 grueling months at Fort Knox in early 1944, using over a dozen microphones to record the unique clatter and squeal of specific armored divisions, like the 761st Tank Battalion. This audio library was then pressed onto massive 16-inch acetate transcription discs. Loaded into a 300-pound custom turntable system inside an M3 half-track, these sounds were blasted through a bank of 500-watt RCA speakers, a mobile orchestra of war that could project the noise of 30,000 men up to 15 miles away. The project was so specialized, its initial budget of $250,000 was hidden in a miscellaneous acquisitions fund. The deep, bone-rattling rumble of recorded tank treads echoing through the Tennessee woods was the first proof that Nance's weaponized soundscape would work. The final, most ethereal layer of the secret was spoof radio. This tiny 16-man team, the Signal Company Special, was led by Lieutenant Arthur P. Jacobson, a radio hobbyist from Ohio. Their mission was to impersonate the Morse code FIST, the unique rhythmic sending style of a real division's radio operators. From a single WC-54 radio truck, just 2 of Jacobson's men could generate hours of perfectly credible, bogus traffic under security protocol S-17B, convincingly mimicking the entire radio net of the 6th Armored Division, from fake supply requests to coded orders. They were ghosts on the airwaves. This was never about a single trick. It was a symphony of deception orchestrated by Major Ralph Ingersoll. With his background as the editor of the newspaper Times PM, Ingersoll scripted the operations like a developing news story, designed to build credibility over 48 to 72 hours. First, Lieutenant Jacobson's radio operators would begin broadcasting, creating the initial chatter for German signals intelligence. A day later, Sergeant Bill Blass's crews would inflate the tanks just before dawn, providing visual confirmation for morning reconnaissance flights. Finally, as darkness fell, Captain Nance's sound trucks would unleash the full auditory assault. This multi-sensory, phased approach was designed to systematically convince every branch of German intelligence that their worst fears were materializing before them. The security measures were nothing short of draconian, designed to make the 100 men and their mission vanish from existence. The 15,000-acre Section K-9 was a black site, its perimeter patrolled 24/7 by armed guards from the 754th Military Police Battalion. Every man in the unit was required to sign Army Form DD-254, acknowledging that a breach of secrecy was punishable by a minimum of 20 years in federal prison. They were issued cover stories, they belonged to an experimental engineering battalion, and given alternate unit patches. If captured, their orders were to identify as members of the 26th Infantry Division, a real unit fighting hundreds of miles away, a final act of misdirection. The project's $1.2 million budget was buried so deep in the War Department's ledgers, under Special Projects ETO, that it was virtually untraceable. The weight of this secrecy was a constant, palpable presence, a pressure that bound them together in absolute silence. On May 14, 1944, the entire apparatus was put to the test in Exercise Cumberland. In the rolling hills of Tennessee, the 23rd was tasked with impersonating the entire 80th Infantry Division. For 36 hours, they ran their full performance. The results were staggering. Observational pilots from the 332nd Fighter Group, flying P-51 Mustangs at 7,000 feet, repeatedly reported a massive, previously unknown armored buildup in the exercise zone. The test was a complete success. For Colonel Reeder and Major Ingersoll, it was the moment they knew their Phantom Army was real enough to bleed the enemy. With their methods proven, the unit shipped out for England on May 2, 1944, aboard the RMS Britannic. Their revolutionary equipment was hidden in plain sight on the cargo manifest, listed under the deliberately boring designation, Pneumatic Demolition Material, Class 4. After arriving in Liverpool on May 12, they were sequestered at a staging area codenamed Camp Walton, near Stratford-upon-Avon. There, artists like Bill Blass and Arthur Shilstone spent weeks refining their techniques, learning how to use the soft, damp English light to their advantage, and directing D7 Caterpillar bulldozers to carve perfectly convincing tank tracks into the muddy soil, a detail that sold the illusion of immense weight. The air was a constant mix of English rain and the faint industrial scent of rubber. Their first true combat mission, Operation Elephant, came in July 1944, near Cerisy-la-Forêt, France, just weeks after the Normandy landings. The 23rd was ordered to draw German attention and artillery fire away from the heavily engaged 2nd Infantry Division. For 48 straight hours, they inflated 24 Sherman decoys and broadcast the sounds of an approaching armored battalion. The ruse was so effective that a German 15 cm SFH-18 artillery battery wasted over 300 high-explosive shells on an empty, muddy field, a deafening barrage that was, for the men of the Ghost Army, the sweetest sound they had ever heard. This baptism by fire solidified the unit's operational doctrine, a four-phase process that Colonel Harry L. Reeder, ever the meticulous artilleryman, documented in a logbook stamped top secret. Phase 1, infiltration, involved moving all 20 of their M3 half-tracks and hundreds of inflatable decoys into position under the absolute cover of darkness, typically between 2,200 and 0400 hours. Phase 2, staging, was the rapid, pre-dawn deployment of visual decoys and the initiation of spoof radio traffic by Lieutenant Jacobson's team. Phase 3, the performance, was a 24 to 72-hour period of full-spectrum deception, with Captain Nance's sonic broadcasts peaking at dawn and dusk. Phase 4, exfiltration, was a silent vanishment, leaving behind just enough physical evidence, tank tracks, a few empty C-ration cans, to cement the illusion in the enemy's mind. It was a repeatable, scalable process of manufacturing reality, a weapon of imagination. For the German High Command, the war on the Western Front in late 1944 had become a maddening puzzle. Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, an intelligence analyst with the Abwehr station near Aachen, couldn't make sense of the reports flooding his desk. On September 21, 1944, a Focke-Wulf FW-189 reconnaissance flight returned with photos showing over 150 tanks from the U.S. 6th Armored Division massing near Metz. Yet 48 hours later, they had vanished. Vogel, a meticulous man who organized his pencils by length, felt the cold knot of confusion tighten in his stomach. The reports from his radio intercept teams of the *Funkaufklärung* were just as bizarre. The division's entire radio network would simply go silent, only to reappear 50 miles away the next day. It wasn't just illogical, it was impossible. The German intelligence apparatus, for all its vaunted efficiency, was built on a foundation of rigid, predictable logic. They trusted two things above all: what their pilots could see, and what their radio operators could hear. Colonel Friedrich Kempe, of the 12th Army's Intelligence Section, and his counterpart, Nammerperokost Anton Staub of the 1st Parachute Army, relied on a system that had served them well for 5 years of war. Aerial reconnaissance provided visual confirmation of unit strength, while signals intelligence tracked their movements by triangulating radio signals and identifying the unique Morse code fist of individual operators. The concept of a dedicated, large-scale deception unit, an army of 100 performers, was so alien to their military doctrine that it wasn't even considered a remote possibility. Any rumors of rubber tanks, which occasionally filtered in from captured GIs or French informants, were dismissed by Kempe himself on October 5, 1944, as, quote, childish Allied propaganda designed to foster overconfidence. This doctrinal blindness was precisely what Major Ralph Ingersoll had counted on. He knew his German counterparts were thorough, but not imaginative. During Operation Bettemberg in Luxembourg from September 15 to 22, 1944, the Ghost Army was tasked with plugging a dangerously thin 25-mile gap in General George S. Patton's line. For 7 straight days, Sergeant Bill Blass, a man who could tell you the exact hue of morning light at 0600 hours, directed his crews as they shuffled their 93-pound D5 inflatable Shermans between 3 different locations. At the same time, Lieutenant Arthur Jacobson's 16-man radio team broadcast a continuous stream of traffic mimicking the 6th Armored Division, using the exact frequency hopping schedule dictated by Protocol S-17B. The result, confirmed by captured documents from the German 82nd Army Corps, was that General der Infanterie * Walter Hornlein kept 2 full infantry divisions in place for a week, bracing for an attack that was never going to come. The air in the German command post was thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and the tension of waiting for a phantom to strike. The Germans simply couldn't square the circle. A reconnaissance pilot, Oberleutnant * Franz Stigler, reported seeing what looked like an entire American tank battalion near the Moselle River on November 10, 1944. But he noted something strange in his debriefing. There were no men visible, no supply trucks, just over 70 tanks sitting perfectly still. His superiors, including Major Adolf Gelände, dismissed it as a clever camouflage attempt by a real unit, never once entertaining the notion that the tanks themselves were the camouflage. The physical evidence left behind, perfectly carved tank tracks made by a D7 bulldozer, only cemented their flawed conclusions. Inside one of Lieutenant Jacobson's WC-54 radio trucks, the air was a fug of sweat, coffee, and the hot metal smell of vacuum tubes. Corporal Sid Goldstein, a 21-year-old from Brooklyn with a prodigious memory for Morse code, would sit for 8-hour shifts, his headphones clamped tight. He wasn't just tapping out dots and dashes, he was performing. He had spent 200 hours at Camp Forest, studying recordings of the 75th Infantry Division's radio net, memorizing the slightly rushed fist of their lead operator. Now, on March 19, 1945, as part of Operation Viersen, he was that operator, sending fake requisitions for 10,000 gallons of fuel to a non-existent supply depot. A performance so convincing it would make German listeners 20 miles away swear the 75th was digging in for a major assault. The consequences of these radio plays were deadly real. On December 20, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the 23rd was rushed to the front to simulate the arrival of the 75th Infantry Division near Bastogne. Based entirely on spoof radio traffic generated by just 2 men, Naive General Feldmarschall * Gerd von Rundstedt diverted the entire 116th Panzer Division to counter this phantom threat for a critical 36-hour period. That decision fatally slowed the German advance, buying precious time for the real 101st Airborne to fortify the city. Von Rundstedt had been beaten by an actor with a telegraph key. The masterpiece of their war was Operation Viersen, which kicked off under a cold drizzle on the night of March 18, 1945. For this performance, Sergeant Bill Blass and the 603rd Camouflage Engineers had to create the illusion of 2 entire divisions, the 30th and 79th Infantry, over 30,000 men, preparing to cross the Rhine. Over the next 48 hours, his crews, their hands numb from the cold, inflated over 600 rubber tanks and 240 dummy aircraft, arranging them in meticulously planned staging areas. Blass, his Parsons School of Design sketchbook filled with diagrams of authentic divisional layouts, personally oversaw the placement of fake command posts, complete with laundry lines hung with GI uniforms to sell the illusion of a long-term encampment. The scale was immense, a 2-division ghost town built in less than 2 nights. Simultaneously, Captain Stanley Nance, a man who treated sound with the reverence of a concert conductor, unleashed his sonic arsenal. From 20 M3 half-tracks hidden in the forests around Viersen, his team began broadcasting their library of war. They didn't just play random tank noises. They followed a script written by Major Ingersoll himself. On the night of March 20th, they played acetate disc number 45A, Armored Division Arrival, for 2 hours, the sound of hundreds of vehicles rolling in. At dawn on the 21 Stone, they switched to disc number 72B, pontoon bridge construction, projecting the cacophony of engineering battalions at work on the riverbank. This 72-hour sonic narrative, blasting from 500-watt RCA speakers and audible 15 miles away, was a story of invasion the Germans couldn't afford to ignore. The deep, percussive clang of recorded sledgehammers on steel echoed across the Rhine, a symphony of lies. The German response was exactly as predicted. On March 22, 1945, at 11:40 a.m., German artillery batteries of the 1st Parachute Army unleashed a furious barrage. Over 1,000 high-explosive shells from their 15 centimeters SFH-18 howitzers rained down, not on 30,000 American soldiers, but on a few square miles of empty German farmland populated by 93-pound rubber decoys. The men of the 23rd, huddled in foxholes 2 miles away, listened to the thunderous explosions with a mixture of terror and triumphant satisfaction. The crump of the shells was the sound of their success. The proof of their victory was discovered weeks later in a captured German command post. The daily situation maps of the 1st Parachute Army, dated March 23, 1945, showed its commander, Go General Oberst Alfred Schlemm, had redrawn his entire defensive line. He had moved 2 full regiments, the 84th and 85th, along with most of his artillery, directly opposite Viersen to counter the phantom American buildup. This left the actual crossing point for Operation Plunder, 10 miles to the north, critically exposed. The map, with its bold red arrows pointing toward a ghost, was the most beautiful work of art the men of the 603rd had ever created. This life of deception took a strange, psychological toll. The men of the 23rd existed in a surreal limbo, closer to the front than most rear-echelon troops, but armed with nothing more than M1 carbines in their wits. Private First Class John Jarvie, a painter from Detroit, wrote in a letter home on March 25, 1945, a letter that would be heavily censored, "We fight the war from a strange distance. We hear it, we see it, we even smell it. But our part is to make noise in shadows." This feeling of being a performer in a deadly play, of risking their lives to save others through illusion, created an unbreakable, unspoken bond. They were the only ones in the world who knew the truth, and the weight of that secret was as heavy as any pack. Their secrecy was their shield. On one occasion during Operation Viersen, a German patrol of 4 soldiers actually stumbled upon the edge of their position. They were met not by a platoon, but by Sergeant Gilbert Seltzer and 3 other GIs from the 23rd. Seltzer, an aspiring actor from New York, put on the performance of his life, shouting fake orders to non-existent squads and firing his M1 carbine into the trees. Convinced they had run into the advance element of a full American company, the German patrol hastily retreated, their report of a heavily defended sector further cementing the illusion in their commander's mind. The unit's existence was protected by the, quote, compartmentation protocol Ultra-A, a security directive so strict that even most Allied Corps-level commanders didn't know they existed. When the 23rd moved into an area, they did so under the designation of a real unit, like the 26th Infantry Division. Their orders came directly from a handful of planners in General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. This prevented any possibility of an accidental leak. The Ghost Army was a secret kept not only from the enemy, but from their own side as well. Because of this elaborate deception, when the real 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions launched their assault across the Rhine on March 24, 1945, as part of Operation Plunder, they met surprisingly light resistance. The German 11th Panzer Division, one of the most feared units on the Western Front, was 10 miles away, racing to counter an army of air and sound. The crossing was a stunning success, achieved with casualty figures nearly 90% lower than the 15,000 projected by G2 intelligence just a week earlier. Lieutenant General William Simpson's army was across the Rhine and pouring into the heart of Germany, and the enemy never knew they'd been beaten by a magic show. Days later, when the first German units re-entered the Viersen sector, they found nothing. Just a muddy, shell-pocked field, littered with the strange, inexplicable tracks of heavy vehicles that had simply vanished into thin air. There were no bodies, no abandoned equipment, no signs of a massive army. For Hauptmann Dieter Vogel and the rest of the German command, it was the final, infuriating act of a ghost they never knew was there. The silence, they found, was more baffling than any battle. As the war ground on, the secret itself began to evolve, becoming a more refined and lethal weapon. After their initial successes in France, Colonel Harry L. Reeder and Major Ralph Ingersoll realized they could conduct more than 20 distinct operations, each one a life-saving performance. Their confidence grew with every German artillery shell that landed harmlessly in an empty field. By September 1944, the 100 men of the 23rd weren't just an experiment. They were masters of their craft, a phantom menace haunting the German front lines from Brittany to the Siegfried Line. The technology of deception was constantly being perfected. Captain Stanley Nance, the quiet acoustical engineer from Bell Labs, began directing his crews in the 3132nd Signal Service Company to mix their soundscapes live. During Operation Brest in August 1944, they didn't just play one recording. They layered acetate disc number 12C, pontoon bridge construction, with number 34A, infantry chatter, creating a complex, multi-layered illusion of an engineering battalion supported by infantry. This sonic tapestry, broadcast from their M3 half-tracks with their humming 500-watt RCA speakers, was so convincing that it drew the full attention of the German 2nd Parachute Division for 48 hours, allowing the U.S. 83rd Infantry to maneuver with an estimated 750 fewer casualties. The air inside the sound trucks was always thick, with the unique, warm smell of the hot acetate discs spinning on their 300-pound turntables. The visual artistry of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, led by Sergeant William Bill Blass, became far more than just inflating rubber tanks. They evolved into what Major Ralph Ingersoll called environmental storytellers. By late September 1944, for Operation Bettenberg, they were using Caterpillar D7 bulldozers, not just to carve tank tracks, but to sculpt entire fake bivouac areas, complete with dummy field kitchens and latrines. For 7 straight days, they maintained this elaborate illusion of the 6th Armored Division, fooling General der Infanterie Walter Hornlein and his 82nd Army Corps into remaining static. This single act saved the real 6th Armored Division an estimated 14,000 gallons of fuel and bought them 3 crucial days to resupply. The men of the 603rd became intimately familiar with the cold, slick texture of the D5 model's neoprene-coated canvas as they inflated and deflated their phantom army night after night. The security protocols became even more stringent. On October 1, 1944, Colonel Reeder, a man who loathed loose ends, officially implemented Compartmentation Protocol Ultra A. This directive meant that the Ghost Army's presence was a secret kept not only from the enemy, but from the very American units they were protecting. They would arrive and vanish like a mist, leaving the GIs in the 4th Infantry Division to wonder why the German artillery had suddenly stopped. This absolute isolation forged the 100 men into a silent brotherhood, bound by a secret no one else on Earth could comprehend. This relentless deception began to induce a sort of tactical paralysis in the German command. Reports compiled by Tauberst Anton Staub of the 1st Parachute Army in November 1944 are filled with confused references to ghost divisions that appeared on reconnaissance photos only to vanish 24 hours later. By December 1, 1944, a directive from General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt's headquarters recommended that field commanders wait for secondary confirmation before committing reserves to counter new American buildups. That hesitation, a seed of doubt planted by Lieutenant Arthur Jacobson's spoof radio operators, was a weapon in itself, slowing German reaction times by a measurable 12 to 24 hours and saving thousands of lives. The unit's impact was becoming devastatingly clear in the Allied casualty reports. During the brutal fighting in the Lorraine campaign, from November 8 to 15, 1944, the 23rd was tasked with drawing fire away from the advancing 95th Infantry Division. Over a 48-hour period, their sonic and visual deceptions attracted over 4,000 rounds of high-explosive shells from German 10.5 centimeters LEFH-18 artillery batteries. For the men of the Ghost Army, huddled in their foxholes, the deafening roar and the percussive shock waves shaking the earth was the sound of over 300 American lives being saved. By the time the Germans launched their desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, the Ghost Army had transformed from a tactical tool into a strategic asset. As the Battle of the Bulge raged, General Omar Bradley personally ordered the unit rushed to Luxembourg. Their mission: impersonate the vanguard of the 75th Infantry Division and create the illusion that powerful reinforcements were arriving. In a stunning display of efficiency, just 200 men, with 8 sound trucks and 60 inflatable tanks, created a phantom force so believable that Generalfeldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt diverted the entire 116th Panzer Division to counter it. This held up the German advance for 36 critical hours, buying the 101st Airborne the priceless time they needed to fortify Bastogne. The men of the 23rd endured the biting, sub-zero temperatures, suffering 2 casualties to frostbite, but their deception saved an entire strategic linchpin from collapse. The spoof radio artists of the Signal Company Special, under Lieutenant Arthur Jacobson, had also elevated their craft. By January 1945, they weren't just mimicking a single operator's fist. They were performing an entire divisional radio network, with up to 15 distinct operator personalities broadcast from a single WC-54 radio truck. Corporal Sid Goldstein, a kid from Brooklyn, became a master of this, creating an entire narrative of a fictional supply sergeant arguing with a company clerk over a missing shipment of 500 wool blankets. This human chatter, so mundane and authentic, was utterly convincing to the German Funkaufklärung teams, tying up an enemy signals intelligence company of 50 men who were trying to make sense of the ghost signals. Across their 21 major operations, the Secret Army had become a decisive factor, a scalpel that allowed Allied commanders like General George S. Patton to shape the battlefield with unprecedented subtlety. The cumulative effect was staggering. Historians like Jonathan Gaughan, after studying the declassified records in 2005, would estimate that the Ghost Army's actions saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives and likely shortened the war in Europe by several weeks, a monumental achievement for a unit armed with little more than air and imagination. As the Allies pushed towards the Rhine in early March 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was no longer an experimental curiosity, but a battle-hardened, finely tuned instrument of war. Colonel Harry L. Reeder had perfected his 4-phase doctrine of infiltration, staging, performance, and exfiltration. The scripts written by Major Ralph Ingersoll were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. The artists under Sergeant Bill Blass and the sound engineers under Captain Stanley Nance were veterans of a strange and secret war. They were a strategic weapon held in reserve for the most critical moment, the final push into Germany. The constant, familiar smell of diesel exhaust from their convoy of 20 M3 half-tracks was the scent of a phantom army on the move, preparing for its grand finale. For 51 years, the secret held. It survived the end of the war, the return of millions of soldiers, and the writing of countless histories. It remained buried in the silence of the 100 men who had sworn an oath. Then, on April 15, 1996, the silence was broken not by a confession, but by the quiet, methodical process of government bureaucracy. At the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, a historian named Jack Neese, his fingers dusty from sifting through logistics files, stumbled upon a folder stamped Top Secret. Its title was innocuous, Official History of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Its file number was 322.0-23. The air in the sterile quiet of Research Room 203 suddenly felt charged, thick with the weight of a story that had refused to die. The revelation wasn't an accident, but an inevitability set in motion years earlier. On April 17, 1995, President Bill Clinton had signed Executive Order 12,958, a sweeping directive that mandated the automatic declassification of most government documents more than 25 years old. The Ghost Army's files, locked away for over half a century, were caught in this massive bureaucratic net. Under the supervision of Dr. Timothy K. Nenninger, the chief archivist for modern military records at NRA, a junior clerk with a heavy rubber stamp, methodically worked through thousands of boxes. Sometime in early 1996, that clerk, whose name is lost to history, opened file 322.0-23 and, with a single percussive thud, stamped the cover page declassified. The sound echoed with 51 years of unspoken truth. Inside the thick, string-bound folder, Jack Neese found a lost chapter of the war. It wasn't just a dry report. It was the unit's entire soul committed to paper. He saw the grainy, black-and-white photographs of 4 GIs casually lifting a 93-pound D5 Model M4 Sherman tank, its rubber skin gleaming under the French sun. He read the after-action report for Operation Viersen, which included captured German maps from the 1st Parachute Army showing how General Oberst Alfred Schlemm had moved 2 entire infantry regiments, the 84th and 85th, to counter their phantom assault. He found the technical schematics for Captain Stanley Nance's 300-pound mobile turntable systems and the official catalog of their 16-inch acetate sound discs. The musty smell of the old paper was overwhelming, a scent of time itself, releasing a history that had been deliberately suffocated for decades. The news spread through the historical community not like a wildfire, but like a seismic shockwave. Neese immediately contacted Stephen E. Ambrose, the preeminent World War II historian of the era. The initial reaction was stunned disbelief. For 50 years, military scholars like Dr. Forrest C. Pogue had analyzed the European theater of operations, based on a fundamentally incomplete set of facts. This single file, number 322.0-23, didn't just add a new detail. It forced a complete recalibration of how key battles, like the crossing of the Rhine, were won. It was as if they had discovered a new, invisible piece on the chessboard. This discovery fundamentally rewrote the narrative of the final push into Germany. The stunning success of Operation Plunder on March 24, 1945, an assault that G2 intelligence under General Omar Bradley had projected, would cost 15,000 casualties but resulted in fewer than 2,000, was no longer just a story of overwhelming American force. It was now a masterpiece of misdirection. The Ghost Army's performance explained the previously baffling German response, why the formidable 11th Panzer Division was 10 miles out of position, and why German artillery batteries had wasted over 1,000 high-explosive shells on an empty field near Viersen on March 22. The victory wasn't just won with steel, it was won with sound, rubber, and pure imagination. For the surviving veterans, the declassification was a profound, life-altering release. For 51 years, they had honored their oath, unable to tell their wives, children, or friends the true nature of their service. Arthur Shilstone, a gifted painter from the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, had a collection of over 60 wartime sketches he had never been able to fully explain. After the U.S. Army Public Affairs Office officially acknowledged the unit's existence in a quiet press release on October 23, 1996, Shilstone, then 74, could finally share his story. In a 2005 interview, his voice thick with emotion, he described their surreal mission. "We were artists, painting and sketching our way across Europe, but our canvases were the battlefields, and our paint was deception. It was the end of a silent, personal burden, carried for a lifetime." The story, once freed, began to take hold in the public consciousness. Jack Neese's initial findings were followed by the meticulously researched 2001 book, The Ghost Army of World War II, by Rick Beyer and Elizabeth Sales. Its cover, featuring the now iconic photograph of 4 soldiers hoisting an inflatable tank, became the defining image of this secret war. For the first time, the names of Colonel Harry L. Reeder, Major Ralph Ingersoll, and the 100 men they commanded entered the historical record, not as a footnote, but as the protagonists of one of the war's most incredible stories. The declassified records solved dozens of tactical puzzles that had perplexed military analysts for decades. Captured German situation maps from the 82nd Army Corps, long held in Archive Group 242 at Nara, suddenly made perfect sense. The maps detailed the week-long hesitation of General der Infanterie * Walter Hornlein during Operation Bettemborg, a delay that had always been attributed to German caution. Now, it was clear he had been paralyzed by the flawless radio deception of Lieutenant Arthur Jacobson's 16-man team. The phantom sightings, the ghost signals, the pointless artillery barrages. It was all the work of the 23rd. The official narrative of the war underwent a permanent transformation. The United States Army Center of Military History began integrating the 23 RD's operations into its formal chronicles, recognizing them as the direct progenitors of modern U.S. Army psychological operations, PSYOPS, and electronic warfare, EW doctrine. The multi-sensory deception techniques pioneered by Major Ralph Ingersoll in 1944, combining visual, sonic, and radio elements into a cohesive narrative, were now understood as the conceptual foundation for the information warfare tactics used in the Gulf War nearly 50 years later. A secret from the past had become a lesson for the future. The final, staggering weight of the revelation lay in the numbers. Across 21 major operations, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, this unit of 100 artists and engineers had convincingly impersonated forces more than 30 times their size. The most conservative estimates, later compiled by military analyst Jonathan Gaughan and validated by the Pentagon, credited them with saving between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. For half a century, the world believed the war was won by brute force alone. The truth, hidden in a single dusty file, was that it was also won by ghosts. The declassification of File 322.0-23 on April 15, 1996, didn't just open a folder, it opened a floodgate of memory for the few hundred surviving veterans. For 51 years, men like painter Arthur Shilstone and aspiring actor Gilbert Seltzer had carried the weight of their 21 clandestine operations in absolute silence. Now, documentarians like Rick Beyer were piecing together their story, a narrative that had been deliberately erased. Bayer's multi-year project, which began in 2005, would culminate in a PBS film that finally gave a public face to the Phantom Army. For these veterans, then in their 80s, the sudden validation was a strange and overwhelming sensation, like the low, constant hum of their old M3 half-track generators finally being switched off after half a century. The impact on military history was nothing short of a paradigm shift. Established scholars like Dr. Stephen E. Ambrose had to fundamentally reevaluate key campaigns. The U.S. Army's Center of Military History officially amended its chronicles of the European Theater of Operations in 2002, formally crediting the 23rd with the success of Operation Plunder. The multi-sensory deception doctrine pioneered by Major Ralph Ingersoll, once a top-secret anomaly, became required reading at West Point and is now a foundational element of the U.S. Army's Field Manual 3-13 for information operations. The techniques used to fool General Oberst Alfred Schlemm in March 1945, using 500-watt RCA speakers and spoof radio, are now recognized as the direct ancestors of the sophisticated electronic and psychological warfare that shaped conflicts from the Gulf War to the present day. The cold, sterile text of modern military doctrine now carries the ghost DNA of 100 artists. This newfound historical importance fueled a decade-long campaign for official recognition, a final mission fought not on the battlefield, but in the halls of Congress. Led by Rick Beyer and the Ghost Army Legacy Project, the effort finally triumphed on February 1, 2022, when President Joe Biden signed the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act into law. By that time, fewer than a dozen of the original 100 men were still alive. The immense honor, one of the nation's highest, was a bittersweet victory for men like Sergeant Bill Blass, who had gone on to a legendary career in fashion design, but could never fully share the story of his first, most dangerous, creative endeavor. For the families of Colonel Harry L. Reeder and the hundreds who had passed away, the medal was a posthumous acknowledgment of a silent, selfless service. Today, the physical traces of the Ghost Army have all but vanished from the European landscape. The muddy fields near Viersen, Germany, are farmed once more, and the forests of Luxembourg, where they plugged General George S. Patton's line, are quiet. But their story is now permanently enshrined in places like the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, which opened a special exhibit in 2020. It features one of the last 7 surviving D-5 inflatable tanks, its 93-pound rubber body now fragile and brittle, alongside some of Arthur Shillstone's original wartime sketches. These artifacts, once tools of a secret war, are now relics that tell a story of how 30,000 lives were saved, not with bullets, but with artistry and audacity. The faint, musty smell of the preserved canvas is a tangible link to an army that was never really there. In the end, their legacy wasn't forged in steel, but in imagination. It wasn't written in blood, but in sound waves and shadows. The final enduring image comes from the formal presentation of the Congressional Gold Medal on March 21, 2024, held within the solemn rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. One of the last 3 surviving veterans, 100-year-old Bernie Bluestein, a former corporal in the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, rose from his wheelchair to receive the honor on behalf of all 100 men. Instead of a military salute, the old artist, his hands still steady after 80 years, slowly raised his fingers and thumb, framing the scene before him as if composing one last, perfect illusion, a final, silent act of creation for an army of ghosts finally brought into the light.